The world of magic doesn't end at the edge of a page. Here love is reborn and extinguished again, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's fire. The heroes we thought we knew reveal their hearts anew. So dive into the magic of emotion and welcome to a place where love is written all over again. The air in the Department of Mysteries didn't circulate. It weighed. It was a thick, invisible shroud scented with cold stone, ozone, and the metallic tang of ancient enchantments. Hermione Granger lived in this silence. She preferred the company of relics that didn't demand explanations for her exhaustion, or the frantic way she rearranged her quills when the world felt too loud. Before her lay the time-turner's progenitor, the great Kronos wheel. It was a jagged, crystalline ring, suspended in a cage of spinning silver. It didn't hum. It breathed, a rhythmic pulse of golden light that flickered like a dying star. Her fingers, stained with ink and calloused from years of gripping a wand, hovered just inches from the silver casing. She was looking for a fracture, a leak in the flow that had been reported by the unspeakables. She needed to fix it. She needed to fix something. The heavy oak door of her laboratory didn't creak. It slammed. The vibration rattled the glass vials on her desk, and Hermione's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The atmosphere changed instantly, the static in the air sharpening until it bit at her skin. Granger. The voice was like a blade drawn across silk, low, aristocratic, and weary. Hermione straightened her spine, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the stone table. She turned slowly, her expression a mask of practiced indifference. Draco Malfoy stood in the doorway, the harsh light of the magical braziers catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked like a sketch drawn in charcoal, all shadows and hard lines. His black tailored robes were immaculate, yet he wore his elegance like armor designed to hide the fact that he was crumbling from within. "Malfoy," she said, her voice steady despite the thrumming in her ears. "This is a restricted area, even for a senior consultant to the Wizengamot." "I don't care about your protocols, Granger," he snapped, taking a step forward. The hollow echo of his boots on the stone floor sounded like a countdown. "My family's estate is being ransacked by your restitution committees. They're seizing heirlooms that have no connection to the dark arts. Stop them." Hermione felt the familiar spark of irritation, a heat that rose from her chest to her cheeks. "Your family's heirlooms are being vetted for blood curses, Draco. It's standard procedure. I don't head that department." "You have the minister's ear," he hissed, moving closer until he was within the orbit of her personal space. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and the bitter underlying scent of stress. "You could end this farce with a single memo, but you won't, will you? You enjoy watching the Malfoys be stripped of every last scrap of dignity." "Dignity?" Hermione let out a sharp, breathless laugh. She stepped toward him, refusing to be intimidated by his height or the cold grey fire in his eyes. "You think this is about dignity? It's about safety. It's about ensuring that the things your father hid behind walls don't kill anyone else." "My father is dead, Granger, and I am paying for his ghost every single day." The outburst was unexpected. Usually, Draco was a wall of ice, but now the ice was cracking. He was close enough that she could see the frantic pulse in his neck, the slight tremor in his gloved hand. The tension between them was a physical thing, a magnetic pull that was as much about old hatred as it was about a shared, unspoken trauma. They were two survivors of a war that hadn't quite finished with them yet. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not until you promise." He reached out, his hand catching her forearm. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was sudden. Hermione flinched, her instinctual reaction to a touch she hadn't invited, and as she moved, her hip caught the edge of the Kronos wheel's pedestal. The silver cage groaned. The golden light inside the crystal turned a violent, bruised purple. "Malfoy, let go!" Hermione cried, her eyes widening as she saw the runes on the floor begin to glow with a blinding, white-hot intensity. "What did you do?" Draco shouted, but he didn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened, his fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeve. The wheel began to spin, not with the graceful movement of a clock, but with a violent, jarring friction that sounded like grinding metal. The scent of ozone exploded, filling the room with the smell of a thunderstorm. The air became thick, liquid-like, making it impossible to breathe. Hermione reached for her wand, but her arm felt like it was miles long, heavy and unresponsive. She looked at Draco. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, visceral terror that mirrored her own. In that split second, the mask of the arrogant aristocrat fell away, leaving only a man who was afraid of the dark. "Draco!" she screamed, his name slipping out for the first time in years. The world tilted. The stone floor vanished, replaced by a sensation of falling through ice water. Time didn't just pass, it folded. Hermione felt her body stretching and compressing, a sickening pressure against her skull. She saw flashes of light, the wall, the library, the Yule Ball, a train, all of it rushing backward like a film being rewound at a frantic pace. Then, the heat. A sudden, stifling warmth that smelled of coal smoke and old leather. Hermione's eyes snapped open. She wasn't standing. She was sitting. The hard, rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of wheels on tracks vibrated through her seat. She blinked, her vision blurred by tears. She looked down at her hands. They were small, soft. The ink stains were gone, replaced by the unblemished skin of a child. Her robes were too big, the sleeves swallowing her wrists. She looked across the narrow compartment of the train. There, slumped against the window, was a boy. He was small, his skin unnaturally pale, his platinum hair slicked back with too much gel. He was wearing a brand new school robe with a silver brooch at the collar. He looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together. Draco Malfoy opened his eyes. They were the same stormy grey, but they were huge in his small, pointed face. He looked at his hands, then at her. He touched his cheek, his fingers trembling. "Granger," he whispered. His voice hadn't broken yet. It was high-pitched, the voice of an 11-year-old boy, but the horror in it belonged to a man of 25. Hermione tried to speak, but her throat was tight. She looked out the window. The rolling green hills of the English countryside were blurred by the rain, but she knew where they were. She knew the date. "We're on the express," she managed to say, her voice sounding alien to her own ears. "September 1st, our first year." Draco stood up, or tried to, but his legs were shorter than he remembered, and he stumbled. He gripped the edge of the luggage rack, his knuckles, small and smooth, turning white. "This is a joke," he hissed, though the bravado was undercut by the way his lip quivered. "Potter, this is some twisted Gryffindor prank, some hallucinogen." "It's the wheel, Draco," Hermione said, her mind already racing, her intellect the only thing that hadn't shrunk. "The resonance. It didn't just send us back. It reset us." She stood up and walked to the small mirror fixed to the compartment door. A girl stared back at her, a girl with bushy, uncontrollable hair and front teeth that were slightly too large. A girl who hadn't yet seen people die. A girl who hadn't been tortured on the floor of a manor. Behind her, she saw Draco's reflection. He was standing in the center of the compartment, looking at her with a mixture of loathing and absolute soul-crushing dependency. In this world, in this time, she was the only thing that was real, the only person who knew he wasn't just a boy. "We have to get back," Draco said, his voice cracking. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to grab her again, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist. "I can't. I won't do this again, Granger. I won't be their puppet again." Hermione looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see the bully or the Death Eater. She saw the boy who had been raised on a diet of pride and fear, now trapped in the very beginning of his own tragedy. "We don't have our wands," she noted, her voice trembling. "Well, we have the ones we bought at Ollivander's, but we don't have our knowledge of how to use them yet. Our bodies, they don't have the muscle memory for the spells we know." "I know how to cast a Cruciatus, Granger," he spat, though he looked like he might vomit. "You're 11, Draco. If you try to cast Unforgivables now, you'll burn your own core out," she snapped, her old-school prefect tone bleeding through. "We have to play along. We have to get to the castle. The wheel. If it's anywhere, it's in the room of requirement or the headmaster's office." The door to the compartment slid open. A round-faced boy with tear-streaked cheeks stood there, clutching a toad. "Sorry," Neville Longbottom stammered. "Have you seen a toad? I've lost him." Hermione felt a physical pang in her chest. Neville, so young, so terrified. She opened her mouth to give her scripted answer, the one she had given years ago, but then she felt a presence behind her. Draco stepped forward. He looked at Neville, and for a second the old, cruel spark lit up his eyes. It would be so easy to sneer, to regain his status by stepping on someone else. Hermione held her breath. Draco looked at the toad, then at Neville's trembling hands. He looked at Hermione, seeing the silent plea in her eyes, the judgment he had lived with for years. "It's under the seat in the next carriage," Draco said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual venom. "I saw a toad hopping toward the back of the train. Go." Neville blinked, stunned by the lack of an insult. "Oh, thank you. Thanks." He scurried away. The silence that followed was heavy. Draco turned away, staring out at the rain. "Why did you do that?" Hermione asked quietly. "Because he's annoying when he cries," Draco muttered, but he wouldn't look at her. Hermione sat back down, her small heart racing. The timeline was already shifting. The friction of their presence here was starting to heat up. They were adults trapped in the skin of children, enemies forced into a terrifying intimacy by the laws of time. "We have to be careful, Draco," she whispered to the glass. "If we change too much, we might never find the way home." "Home?" Draco turned, a bitter, haunting smile touching his young lips. "Granger, look at me. I have no home to go back to, just a museum of failures. He sat down opposite her, the space between them suddenly feeling much smaller than it had in the ministry. The tension was no longer just about the past. It was about the terrifying blank slate of the future. The train let out a long, mournful whistle as it rounded a bend, the silhouette of Hogwarts appearing through the mist. The castle looked different, not like a fortress or a school, but like a predator waiting to swallow them whole. They were back to being 11. And the world had no idea that the two most broken people in Britain were about to start over. The Great Hall was exactly as she remembered it, yet it felt like a fever dream. The enchanted ceiling mirrored a stormy sky, heavy with purple-tinged clouds and flickering lightning that illuminated the 4 long tables below. Hundreds of candles floated in the void, their wax dripping into thin air, casting a warm, flickering glow that should have been welcoming. Instead, the light felt abrasive. To Hermione, the shadows in the corners of the hall seemed deeper, hiding the ghosts of a future that hadn't happened yet, and some that had. She stood in the line of shivering first years, her small hands balled into fists inside her oversized sleeves. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, pumpkin juice, and the ancient, dusty magic of the stones. Beside her, she could feel Draco. He didn't look at her, but his presence was a cold weight. He stood with a rigid, unnatural grace, his chin tilted upward in that familiar Malfoy arrogance, but she noticed the way his fingers twitched against his thighs. He was terrified. "Granger! Hermione!" Professor McGonagall's voice rang out, sharp and clear. Hermione felt a visceral jolt. Seeing Minerva so young, relatively, with no lines of war around her eyes, was almost too much to bear. Hermione walked forward, her legs feeling like lead. Every eye in the hall was on her. She felt the weight of the sorting hat as it was dropped over her eyes, plunging her into darkness. "Ah," a small, dry voice whispered in her ear. "A returner. How curious. A mind full of scars, memories of fires and battles, and a heart that has learned the value of a name it once hated." "Not now," Hermione thought fiercely, her nails digging into the wood of the stool. "Just put me where I belong. Don't say a word." "Gryffindor!" the hat bellowed to the hall. The applause was a roar that made her wince. She hurried to the red and gold table, her eyes instinctively searching for Harry and Ron. They were there, children. Harry, with his broken glasses held together by tape, looking small and overwhelmed. Ron, with a smudge of dirt on his nose, laughing at something Seamus Finnegan said. A wave of grief washed over her so suddenly she had to catch her breath. They were her boys, her brothers, but they didn't know her. Not yet. To them, she was just the bossy girl from the train. She sat down, her back to the Slytherin table, but she could feel a gaze burning into her shoulder blades. Malfoy. Draco. The hall went silent as the golden boy of the pure-blood elite stepped up. Hermione turned slightly, unable to stop herself. Draco sat on the stool, his face a pale mask. The hat had barely touched his silver-blonde hair when it screamed, "Slytherin!" He moved to his table with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He sat among the sons of Death Eaters, boys who would one day follow him into darkness or lead him there. Hermione saw him catch her eye for a fraction of a second. There was a plea in that look, a moment of raw, unadulterated panic before he turned away to shake hands with Crabbe and Goyle. The feast was ashes in her mouth. She watched Harry and Ron, listening to their chatter about Quidditch and sweets, feeling like an ancient ghost haunting a nursery. Every time she looked at the high table, she saw Dumbledore watching her. His blue eyes weren't twinkling, they were searching. He knew, or he sensed a ripple in the tapestry of time. That night, in the Gryffindor dormitory, Hermione lay awake. The familiar red hangings of her four-poster bed felt like the walls of a cell. The rhythmic breathing of Lavender and Parvati filled the room, a reminder of a simplicity she no longer possessed. Her mind was a chaotic map of the castle, calculating where the Chronos wheel could be. It hadn't been in the Department of Mysteries yet. It had been moved there in 1996. Before that, it was rumoured to be kept in the restricted section of the library or the headmaster's private vault. The next morning, the emotional seesaw she dreaded began in earnest. She was walking through the stone corridors toward Transfiguration when she saw him. Draco was surrounded by a gaggle of Slytherins, his voice loud and sneering as he mocked Neville's clumsiness. "Look at him, the great Mimblus Mimbletonia," Draco drawled, his eyes cold. "Can't even keep his robes straight. Pathetic." Hermione felt a surge of genuine rage. The empathy she had felt on the train evaporated. He hasn't changed, she thought, her teeth grinding together. He's just playing the same cruel game because it's easy. She stepped forward, her books clutched to her chest. "Leave him alone, Malfoy." Draco turned. The sneer deepened, but as his eyes met hers, she saw a flicker of the man from the Ministry, the one who had screamed her name as the world tore apart. The mask slipped for a heartbeat, revealing a hollow exhaustion. Then it snapped back into place. "Ah, the mudblood speaks," he said, the slur hitting her like a physical blow. The Slytherins around him laughed. Hermione flinched. She knew he had to say it. She knew he was playing a part to survive his own house, but the words still carried the weight of the scars on her arm, scars that wouldn't appear for another 7 years. "You're a coward," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a profound sense of betrayal. She had seen his soul in that laboratory. She had seen the broken man. To see him hide behind this vile persona was worse than the insult itself. She pushed past him, her shoulder clipping his. As she did, she felt a sudden, sharp heat. A static discharge of magic jumped between them, a golden spark that made them both gasp. For a second, the corridor vanished, and they were back in the Department of Mysteries, the smell of ozone choking them. Draco's hand flew to his arm, the one she had brushed. He looked at her, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged hitches. The other students didn't notice, but to Hermione, the world had gone silent. "We are tethered," she realized with a sinking dread. The wheel didn't just send us back, it bound our magic together. That afternoon, she sought refuge in the library. The smell of old parchment and floor wax usually calmed her, but today it felt like a reminder of everything she had to do. She was hunched over a volume on ancient chronomancy when a shadow fell across the page. She didn't look up. "Go away, Malfoy. I believe you have some first years to bully." He didn't move. He sat down in the chair opposite her, his movements stiff. The library was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long golden bars across the dusty floor. "I had to," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. Gone was the childish drawl. This was the voice of the man. "You didn't have to use that word," Hermione said, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You know what it means. You know what happens." Draco leaned forward, his small face twisted in a grimace of pain. "You think I want to be here? You think I enjoy looking at these people, my friends, knowing which ones will become murderers, knowing which ones I'll have to watch die?" He slammed a small fist onto the table, the sound muffled by the carpet. "I have to stay in character, Granger. If I don't, my father will hear. And if he suspects I've turned soft, I won't survive the winter break." The honesty was a sudden, jarring shift. The warmth of his vulnerability bled through the cold exterior. Hermione felt her anger waver. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his small frame seemed to be vibrating with the effort of holding himself together. "We need to find the wheel," she said, her voice softening. "I've looked in the common room," Draco said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "There's nothing, but there's a resonance, Granger. Every time I'm near you, I feel it, like a wire being pulled taut in my chest." "I feel it too," she admitted, her gaze dropping to his hands. They were so small, yet the way he gripped the table was the same way he had gripped his wand in the ministry. "Our magic is trying to reconnect with the point of origin. We're like two ends of a broken circuit." She reached out, her hand hovering over his. It was a moment of profound tension, a choice to bridge the gap between two lifetimes of enmity. She moved her fingers, grazing the back of his hand. The sensation was electric. It wasn't the violent spark of the corridor, but a slow, rhythmic thrum. It felt like a heartbeat. Draco didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, allowing her palm to rest against his. For a moment, the library, the castle, and the year 1991 ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of skin and the terrifying, beautiful realization that they were no longer alone in this nightmare. "We'll find it," she whispered. Draco's eyes searched hers, searching for a forgiveness she wasn't sure she could give, but offering a truce he desperately needed. "Granger," he started, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Malfoy, there you are." The voice of Pansy Parkinson shattered the moment like a hammer through glass. Draco snatched his hand back as if burned. His face shuttered instantly. He stood up, his expression reverting to one of bored disdain. "Just checking to see if the library's most pathetic resident has found a way to grow her teeth back yet," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the stacks. Pansy giggled, hooking her arm through his. "Oh, Draco, don't waste your time on her. Let's go." He let her lead him away, but just before he disappeared behind a bookshelf, he looked back. The coldness in his eyes was absolute, a wall of ice designed to keep her out. Hermione sat in the silence, her hand still warm where he had touched it. The cold had returned, sharper and more biting than before. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a mixture of longing and fury. He was a coward, yes. He was a survivor, yes. But as she looked down at the empty chair, she realized the hardest part of this journey wouldn't be finding the magic to go home. It would be surviving the man who was becoming her only anchor in a world that hadn't happened yet. She went back to her book, but the words blurred. The internal conflict was a physical weight, a friction between the Hermione who remembered the war and the Hermione who was beginning to see the boy behind the monster. The slow burn of their connection was lighting a fire she wasn't sure she could extinguish. Every look, every touch, every whispered word was a step into a minefield. And as the moon rose over the black lake, casting silver light into the library, Hermione knew that the boy in the Slytherin dungeon was dreaming of the same thing she was, a way out or a way in. The tension between them was no longer just a byproduct of the time turner. It was becoming the very air they breathed. And in the dark, silent halls of Hogwarts, the ghosts of their future selves watched and waited as the two children who knew too much began their long, agonizing dance toward each other. She closed the book, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The first week was over, and the war for their souls had only just begun. The seesaw had tipped into the dark again, and as she walked back to Gryffindor Tower, she wondered if she would ever feel warm again without his hand in hers. The clock in the hall struck midnight, a hollow, metallic sound that seemed to mock her. 11 years old. They had 7 years of hell to navigate, or one miracle to find. Hermione pulled her robes tighter, the bite of the silver ring she wore, a souvenir from her own time, reminding her that she didn't belong here. But as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't help but think of the way Draco's eyes had softened in the library. She couldn't help but think of the boy who saved a toad. The friction was there. The static was building. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the next time they touched, the world might just burn. The Scottish autumn arrived with a vengeance, wrapping the castle in a shroud of grey mist and persistent, biting rain. The stone walls of Hogwarts felt dampened, the dampness seeping into the very marrow of Hermione's bones. Every morning she woke up to the high-pitched chatter of young girls, her mind instantly cataloguing the differences between this life and the one she had left behind. In her true time, the halls of the ministry were sanitized and silent. Here, they were a chaotic symphony of life that felt increasingly like an insult to her memories. She found herself avoiding the great hall during peak hours. The sight of the Golden Trio, the version that included a version of her that didn't yet exist, was a source of agonizing cognitive dissonance. She watched her younger self from a distance, seeing the girl's frantic need to prove herself, the way she raised her hand for every question, her desperate search for belonging. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger. Her real anchor, the only person who shared the crushing weight of the future, was the boy who was supposed to be her greatest enemy. The cold that had settled between them after the library incident persisted for weeks. In potions, Draco was a master of performance. He sat with his fellow Slytherins, his sneer fixed in place like a porcelain mask. He brewed his draught of living death with a precision that far exceeded an 11-year-old's capability, earning oily praise from a younger, more vigorous Severus Snape. Hermione felt the sting of it. Every time she caught his eye, he looked through her. It was a calculated repulsion, a defensive wall built of pure-blood elitism and childhood cruelty. He ignored her in the corridors, and once, when they crossed paths near the moving staircases, he stepped aside as if her very presence was a contagion. "He is protecting himself," her mind whispered. "He is a coward," her heart screamed back. The internal monologue was a constant, exhausting friction. She spent her nights in the library, scouring texts on chronos anchoring and dimensional displacement. Her fingers traced the tooth of old parchment until they were sore. She was looking for a way back, but she was also looking for him. The shift happened on a Tuesday under the weeping willow near the Black Lake. The rain had turned to a fine silver needle drizzle. Hermione was sitting on a damp stone, trying to make sense of a complex arithmancy chart when she heard the crunch of gravel. She didn't look up. The scent of sandalwood and something sharp, like the smell of ozone before a hex, announced him. "You're going about it the wrong way," Draco said. His voice was low, stripped of the drawl he used for the public. He sounded older, weary in a way that made her chest ache. Hermione finally lifted her head. He was standing a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked small against the backdrop of the towering castle, but his shadow was long and jagged. "Am I?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Perhaps you'd like to share your vast knowledge of time magic, Malfoy. Or are you too busy perfecting your mudblood sneer?" He flinched. The reaction was subtle, a slight tightening of his jaw, a brief closing of his eyes. But it was there. He walked closer, his boots sinking into the soft mud. "I have to maintain the facade, Hermione. If I don't, the letters to my mother start to sound suspicious. My father, he expects a certain report from Lucius's contacts within the school. If I'm seen fraternizing with you, I lose my position. And without my position, I can't get into the restricted section after hours." "So, it's all strategy?" she challenged, standing up. She was shorter than him now, a fact that frustrated her to no end. She had to look up to meet his gaze. The insults, the coldness, it's all for the greater good of your survival. "It's the only way I know how to survive," he snapped, his composure breaking. He stepped into her space, his face inches from hers. "You have your friends. You have the chosen one and his loyal sidekick. They'll love you no matter what. I have a den of vipers who are waiting for me to show a single moment of weakness so they can tear me apart. You don't know what it's like to live in a house where love is a currency and you're already bankrupt." The raw honesty of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The warmth rushed back, a sudden, overwhelming surge of empathy that blurred the lines of her resentment. She saw the boy who had been forced to grow up in a graveyard of expectations. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her anger dissolving like sugar in tea. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the sound of the rain hitting the lake. Draco didn't pull away. He stood there, his breath hitching, looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out. His hand was cold, his skin pale against the dark fabric of his sleeve. He hesitated, his fingers hovering near her cheek, before he finally made contact. The touch was light, almost a ghost of a sensation, but the magical static it ignited was visceral. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a hum, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to align their heartbeats. Hermione's breath hitched. In that silence, in that tiny, forbidden space between them, the war felt 1,000 years away, and the ministry felt like a dream she had once had. "The wheel isn't in the library," he said, his voice a mere tremor. "I found a record in the Slytherin archives. It was moved to the Room of Requirement during the 1990 transition. It's being kept in a state of stasis. But it's guarded, Hermione. not by spells, but by intent. Intent, she breathed, her eyes locked on his. It only appears to those who are truly lost in time, he explained, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. The bite of his silver ring against her skin was a grounding, tactile friction. We have to be together when we find it. Our magic it's intertwined. I can feel you, even when you're on the other side of the castle. It's like a dull ache that only stops when I'm near you. Hermione felt a traitorous thrill at his words. The approach was intoxicating. She lunged into his touch, her eyes closing. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the years of pain, the blood on the floor of Malfoy Manor, the names he had called her. Here, in the rain, they were just two souls adrift. But then, the repulsion returned with a cruel twist. "Malfoy! Draco! Where are you?" The voice of Theodore Nott drifted from the path above. Draco's hand dropped as if it had been burned. His expression shifted instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of cold grey stone. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Get away from me, Granger," he said, his voice loud and harsh, projecting for whoever was listening. "I don't need a lecture on my essay from a pathetic know-it-all like you." He turned on his heel and strode away without a backward glance. Hermione stood alone in the rain, her cheek still tingling from his touch. The betrayal felt sharper this time because she had allowed herself to trust the warmth. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the fabric as she tried to regain her composure. The next few days were an exercise in emotional torture. Every time she saw him, she looked for a sign, a flicker of the boy in the rain, but he was flawless. He was the perfect Slytherin prince, cruel and distant. He even went so far as to sabotage her potion in class, adding a pinch of powdered bice to her cauldron when Snape wasn't looking, causing it to emit a foul-smelling grey smoke. 5 points from Gryffindor for Miss Granger's lack of focus, Snape drawled. Draco smirked, his eyes meeting hers with a cold, mocking triumph. Hermione felt a hollow echo of footsteps in her heart as she walked to her next class. Was he playing the part, or was the part becoming him? Or worse, was the man she had met in the laboratory just a version of him that had long since died? The doubt was a poison. She began to wonder if she was the only one who truly remembered the future, or if Draco was simply using their shared secret to toy with her. After all, he was a Malfoy. Manipulation was in his blood. Her internal conflict reached a breaking point on Friday night. She had stayed late in the charms classroom, practicing the wand movements for Alohomora, not because she didn't know them, but because her small, clumsy fingers needed the training. The door opened, and she didn't even have to look. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, the air becoming charged with that familiar magnetic pull. "Get out," she said, her voice flat. "Granger!" "No," she snapped, turning to face him. Her hair was a wild, frizzy halo around her face, and her eyes were bright with fury. "I'm done with your emotional seesaws, Draco. 1 minute you're touching my face in the rain, and the next you're losing me points and sneering at my blood. I can't do it. I'd rather be stuck in 1991 alone than have to wonder every second which version of you I'm talking to." Draco didn't move. He stood by the door, his silhouette framed by the candlelight of the corridor. He looked older in the dim light, the shadows stretching from his feet to hers. "You think I like it?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You think I enjoyed watching you look at me with that loathing in potions? It's killing me, Hermione. I'm splitting in two. One half of me is the boy who has to be a monster to stay safe, and the other half is the man who just wants to hold your hand and tell you he's sorry." "Then say it," she challenged, stepping toward him. "Say it without the mask. Say it where no one can hear you." He walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. The tension in the room was a living thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of sandalwood and rain-washed stone filling her senses. He didn't say a word. Instead, he reached out and gripped the edge of the desk behind her, effectively pinning her between the wood and his body. He wasn't touching her, but the proximity was a visceral alignment of their energies. "I am sorry," he rasped, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I am sorry for the names. I am sorry for the manner. I am sorry that I am the only one who can save you, and I am the very person you should be saved from." The warmth was back, but it was different now, deeper, more dangerous. It was the heat of a fire that could either warm a room or burn a house down. Hermione felt the tremor in his arms as he held himself back. "We're supposed to be enemies," she whispered, her voice failing her. "We were," he corrected, his gaze dropping to her lips. "But time has a way of eroding foundations, doesn't it? Everything I thought I knew, it's all rotting. The only thing that feels real is the friction of being near you." He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. It was a moment of profound, non-verbal intimacy. They stood there in the silence of the classroom, two children with the souls of survivors, breathing in the same air. Hermione felt her doubts begin to melt. She felt the static, the magnetic pull, the atmospheric pressure of his presence. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the final inch, but the fear of the next cold shift held her back. "We have to find the room," she murmured against his skin. "Tomorrow," he promised, his voice a low thrum against her brow. "Tomorrow night, when the castle sleeps, we'll find the wheel. And then... He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. For the first time, the grey of his eyes wasn't stormy. It was clear, like the sky after a gale. "And then we decide who we are," he said. He turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the vacant corridor. Hermione sank back against the desk, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The warmth remained, a lingering heat that refused to fade. She looked at the candle flickering on her desk, the flame dancing in the draught. The approach had been made. The trust was a fragile, crystalline thing, but it was there. And as she blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, she realized that the conflict was no longer between her and Draco. It was between the world they knew and the one they were creating together, one stolen moment at a time. The slow burn had become a steady flame, and she knew that by tomorrow night they would either be on their way home or they would be lost in the fire forever. Saturday night descended upon the Highlands like a velvet curtain, heavy and impenetrable. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a world that smelled of damp earth and ancient secrets. Inside the castle, the air was stagnant, the flickering torches along the corridors casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for Hermione's ankles as she crept toward the 7th floor. Every floorboard that groaned under her weight felt like a betrayal. Her heart was a frantic drum echoing in the hollow of her chest. She was draped in her heavy winter cloak, her fingers numb from the chill that clung to the stone walls. She reached the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, her breath hitching. The silence here was absolute, a heavy, expectant pressure that made her ears ring. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near a suit of armor. Hermione's hand flew to her chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of her robes. Draco stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through a high window. He looked ghostly, his platinum hair shimmering, his face a pale oval of concentration. He didn't speak. The time for tense dialogues had given way to a necessity for shared silence. He simply nodded, a sharp, jerky movement, and stepped toward the blank stretch of wall. I need the place where time is held. I need the place where the broken is stored. Hermione joined him, closing her eyes and projecting the image of the Department of Mysteries, the smell of the Chronos wheel, and the visceral need to return to the life they had fought so hard to survive. They walked past the wall 3 times. On the 3rd pass, the stones began to ripple like water. A door of dark, polished wood, inlaid with silver runes, materialized out of the solid masonry. Draco reached for the handle, his small hand trembling. Before he turned it, he looked at Hermione. The magnetic pull between them was so strong it felt like a physical wire being pulled taut. "If this works," he whispered, his voice a ragged thread in the dark. "Everything we've done here, it vanishes. The toad, the library, the rain, it all becomes a dream we had in the Department of Mysteries." "It has to," Hermione said, though the words felt heavy. "We don't belong in these bodies, Draco. We're ghosts here." "I know," he rasped, "but I've never felt more alive than when I was hating you in potions today, knowing you were the only one who actually knew who I was." He turned the handle. The room of requirement didn't present itself as a cozy study or a hidden forest. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, filled with the debris of centuries. Piles of broken furniture, mountains of forbidden books, and rusted armor stretched into the darkness. But in the center, bathed in a low, pulsating purple glow, stood a familiar sight: the Chronos wheel. It was smaller than the one in the Ministry, more delicate, its silver rings spinning with a frantic, uneven friction. The scent of ozone and old parchment was overwhelming. "There," Hermione breathed, her feet moving of their own accord. As they approached, the atmosphere changed. The static grew so intense that her hair began to stand on end. The closer they got, the more the room seemed to blur. The piles of junk flickered, shifting between their current forms and the trees of the forbidden forest, then back again. "Wait," Draco said, catching her sleeve. His grip was frantic. "Granger, look at the base." At the foot of the wheel's pedestal lay a scattering of silver sand. It was leaking from the central crystal, a slow, shimmering bleed of time itself. "It's unstable," Hermione diagnosed, her analytical mind snapping into place. "It's not just a portal, it's a wound. If we touch it without stabilizing the resonance, we might not just go home. We might be scattered across the timeline." "How do we stabilize it?" Draco asked, his eyes wide with the terror of a boy and the desperation of a man. "The resonance is us," she realized, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The wheel reacted to our friction in the laboratory. It sent us back because our magic collided in a state of extreme conflict. To go back, we need to provide a counter-signal. We need to align. Align? Draco let out a harsh, jagged laugh. We're a Malfoy and a Granger. We don't align. We collide. That's all we've ever done. We aligned in the library, she reminded him, taking a step closer. The purple light of the wheel turned his eyes into pools of amethyst. We aligned under the willow. Draco, the only reason we're here together is because our lives have been tangled since we were 11. We are the two ends of the same broken circuit. She held out her hand, palm up. It was an invitation to the ultimate approach, a bridge across a decade of blood and prejudice. Draco stared at her hand. He looked like he wanted to run, to retreat into the cold safety of his Slytherin mask. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his own robes. The repulsion was screaming in his mind, the voices of his father, the expectations of his name, the fear of being vulnerable. Then, slowly, he reached out. His fingers brushed hers, and the world exploded. It wasn't pain. It was a visceral alignment of every memory they shared. Hermione saw the fire of the Room of Requirement from their 7th year. She felt the sting of her own slap across his face in 3rd year. She saw the look of utter defeat in his eyes on the astronomy tower. And beneath it all, she felt his guilt, a cold, rotting weight at the foundation of his soul. "Don't," he choked out, trying to pull away. "Don't look at it. Don't look at what I am." "I've already seen it," she said, her voice echoing as if they were underwater. She stepped into his space, her other hand coming up to cup his face. The bite of his silver ring against her skin was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I saw the man who couldn't kill Dumbledore. I saw the man who stayed in the manor to protect his mother. I see you, Draco." The warmth was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. The wheel began to hum in a perfect, harmonious chord. The silver sand at the base began to spiral upward, caught in the magnetic pull of their joined magic. Draco's breath hit her lips, warm and trembling. The tension between them had reached its peak. The cord stretched so thin it was glowing. They were 11 years old, standing in a room of lost things, but their souls were reaching out with the hunger of people who had been starving for a lifetime. "I can't go back to being that person," he whispered against her skin. "I can't go back to being the boy who hates you." "Then don't," she murmured. "We change the ending." The wheel let out a blinding flash of white light. The room began to dissolve. The piles of junk turned into streaks of color. The floor beneath them vanished. In that moment of transition, in the gap between then and now, Draco's hand slid from hers to the back of her neck. He pulled her forward, his forehead crashing against hers with a jarring impact. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was a visceral, tactile claim. It was the friction of two souls refusing to be torn apart by the current of time. "Hold on!" he roared over the sound of the rushing wind. "Granger, hold on to me!" She threw her arms around his neck, her small fingers tangling in his hair. The atmospheric pressure was crushing, a weight that threatened to flatten them into nothingness. She felt the hollow echo of their footsteps in the ministry, the scent of sandalwood, the bite of the cold stone. Then the cold returned, a sudden, violent repulsion. Hermione's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the hard stone floor of her laboratory. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by the scent of dust, and the faint, lingering aroma of her own tea. The braziers were flickering low. She scrambled to her feet, her head spinning. Her body felt heavy, her limbs long and uncoordinated. She looked at her hands. They were large again, stained with ink, the skin of a woman who had seen too much. She looked across the room. Draco Malfoy was slumped against the pedestal of the Kronos wheel. He was back in his black tailored robes, his face sharp and aged by the lines of his recent years. He was gasping for air, his hand clutching his chest. The wheel was silent. The silver rings were still. "Malfoy," she whispered, her voice back to its soulful adult alto. He lifted his head. His grey eyes were bloodshot, his expression a chaotic mix of shock and grief. He looked around the room, at the familiar shelves of her office, at the mundane reality of the Ministry of Magic. He stood up, his movements stiff and aristocratic, but there was a tremor in his hands that he couldn't hide. He smoothed his robes, the mask of the senior consultant sliding back into place, but it was cracked. It was a ruin. It was... He stopped, his voice failing him. He looked at her, and for a second the cold was so intense it made her shiver. It was a hallucination, a temporal feedback loop. "It wasn't," Hermione said, taking a step toward him. "Draco, you saved the toad. You touched my face in the rain." He flinched as if she had struck him. "That didn't happen, Granger. We were here. We fell. That's all." The betrayal was a physical pain in her chest. How could he? After everything they had shared in that ghost of a past, how could he turn back into the Iceman of the present? "You're a liar," she said, her voice trembling. "You're a coward, just like you were at 11. You're so afraid of what we felt that you'd rather pretend it was a dream." "I have to," he shouted, the sound echoing in the small room. "Do you have any idea what it would mean if it was real? It means I've wasted half my life hating the only person who understands me. It means I have to look at you every day and know that I... He stopped, his breath hitching. The tension in the room was a living thing again, but this time it was laced with the bitterness of lost time. "That you what?" she challenged, her eyes burning with tears. "That I can't help but think about you," he whispered, his voice so low she almost missed it. "Every hour, every minute, even before the wheel, Granger. Why do you think I came here today? To talk about restitution? I have a dozen lawyers for that. I came here because I needed to see you." The warmth didn't return. Instead, a deep magnetic pull took its place, a gravity that neither of them could fight. Draco took a step toward her, his face a mask of agony. "But it doesn't change anything. I am still a Malfoy. You are still the minister's favorite. The world hasn't moved an inch, even if we've lived a lifetime in a blink." He turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. "Draco!" she called out. He stopped, but didn't turn. "The wheel didn't send us back to fix the past," she said, her voice steadying. "It sent us back to see if we were worth saving in the present." He stood perfectly still for a long moment. The silence between them was like a heavy fog, thick with the things they hadn't said. Then, without a word, he opened the door and vanished into the shadows of the Department of Mysteries. Hermione was left alone in the flickering candlelight. She looked at the Kronos wheel, now just a dead piece of crystal and silver. She felt the hollow ache in her chest, the doubt that he would ever come back. But as she reached out to straighten her quills, Her fingers brushed the spot on the table where he had gripped it. It was still warm. The slow burn had moved from the halls of Hogwarts to the corridors of her heart. And she knew, with the weary certainty of a woman who had lived through 2 lives, that the friction between them was only just beginning to produce light. The first part of their journey was over. The second, more dangerous part, the one where they had to live with what they knew, had just begun. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She didn't see the 11-year-old girl anymore. She saw a woman who was done waiting for the timeline to be right. She picked up her wand, the wood warm in her hand, and began to work. If the wheel wouldn't give her the ending she wanted, she would carve it out of the present with her own 2 hands. The atmospheric pressure in the room remained, a lingering ghost of his presence. And in the silence, she could still hear his voice, a high-pitched echo from a train carriage. Granger. The hunt for the man behind the mask was on. And this time, she wasn't letting him hide in the shadows of his own history. The days following the Ministry incident felt like walking through a thick, suffocating fog. Hermione moved through her life with a mechanical precision that masked the internal chaos. She attended briefings, she drafted reports on temporal fluctuations, and she sat in the Ministry cafeteria, staring at the steam rising from her tea. But her mind was perpetually anchored in the 7th floor of a castle that felt more real than the stone walls of London. The cold Draco had left behind was not a simple absence of warmth. It was a biting, frost-laden silence that echoed in every corridor of the Department of Mysteries. He hadn't returned. No more demands about family heirlooms, no more sharp-tongued debates in the Wizengamot hallways. He had vanished into the shadows of Malfoy Manor, and Hermione felt the betrayal of that silence, like a physical weight on her chest. She was back in her laboratory on a Thursday evening, the rain drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against the enchanted glass. The scent of ozone had faded, replaced by the dry, dusty smell of old parchment and the sharp tang of the ink she used to categorize her findings. She was obsessively reviewing the schematics of the Chronos wheel, her fingers tracing the silver runes. We didn't imagine it, she told herself for the 1000th time. The tactile friction of his hand, the way his eyes looked before the light took us, that wasn't a feedback loop. A soft, rhythmic tapping at her door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic pulse that she tried to suppress. "Enter," she said, her voice sounding thinner than she liked. The door opened, but it wasn't Draco. It was an owl, a sleek eagle owl with feathers the color of a winter sky. It carried a small, heavy parcel wrapped in black silk. It landed on her desk with a dignified flutter, extended its leg, and waited. Hermione untied the package with trembling fingers. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn, and a single silver ring. The ring was the one he had worn in the vision, the bite of the silver against her skin that had grounded her in the past. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The approach was subtle, a silent olive branch extended from the darkness. She touched the leather of the journal. It felt like the tooth of old parchment, familiar and grounding. She opened it to the first page. "The foundation was never as solid as I led you to believe," the first line read, in a handwriting that was elegant yet strained. "I spent years trying to convince myself that the friction between us was hate. I was wrong. It was gravity. Hermione sank into her chair, the journal heavy in her lap. It wasn't a dry retelling of events. It was a confession of internal monologues that spanned years. He wrote of the fear he felt as an 11-year-old, seeing her for the first time and feeling an instinctive magnetic pull he had been taught to fear. He wrote of the warmth he had felt in the library and the agonizing cold he had to project to keep her at bay. The warmth flooded back into her laboratory, a slow, emotional heat that made her eyes sting. He was showing her, not telling her. Through his words, she felt the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his wand during the war, the way he had intentionally avoided her gaze for years because he couldn't handle the atmospheric pressure of her disappointment. She didn't sleep that night. She read the journal cover to cover, her internal conflict shifting from anger to a profound, aching vulnerability. By the time the grey light of dawn filtered through the glass, she knew what she had to do. She didn't go to the manor. She went to the one place where they had truly seen each other without the masks. The black lake was shrouded in mist when she arrived. The air was crisp, the scent of damp pine and cold water filling her lungs. She walked toward the weeping willow, the same spot where they had stood in the rain. He was already there. Draco was standing by the water's edge, his black robes a stark contrast to the silver fog. He looked older, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced in the natural light, but he wasn't wearing his armor. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The tension between them as she approached was electric. Every step she took felt like moving through a magnetic field. When she was 10 feet away, he turned. "You came," he said. His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its aristocratic polish. "You sent the ring," she replied, holding it up. The bite of the silver. I remembered it. He walked toward her, the hollow echo of his boots on the damp earth sounding like a countdown. He stopped just outside her personal space, the scent of sandalwood and rain-washed stone enveloping her. "I tried to stay away," he admitted, his gaze searching hers. "I tried to convince myself that the ministry was enough, that I could go back to being the man who simply ignores the rot in his foundation. But the friction, it wouldn't stop, Hermione. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that train, seeing you for the first time. We can't go back to who we were, Draco," she said, her voice trembling. "Not after seeing the beginning." "I don't want to go back," he said, taking a final step forward. The proximity was overwhelming, a visceral alignment that made her breath hitch. "I'm tired of the seesaws. I'm tired of the cold." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, just as it had in the rain. This time, he didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed her cheek, his skin warm and slightly rough. The touch ignited a thrum of magic between them, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to harmonize with the very earth beneath their feet. Hermione leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. The trust was a fragile, crystalline thing, but in this moment it felt unbreakable. "We have so much to fix," she whispered. "Then we fix it," he said, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. "But not as ghosts, as people who finally know the cost of the silence." The internal monologue of doubt that had plagued her for years finally fell silent. There was no repulsion here, no betrayal waiting in the shadows. There was only the atmospheric pressure of two souls who had finally found their center. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. It was a slow burn of an intimacy, a quiet, profound promise. They stood there in the mist, two survivors of a war and a time loop, finally allowing the warmth to settle. "I can't help but think," she murmured, echoing his words from the laboratory. "Don't think," he whispered against her skin. "Just feel." The silence of the lake was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. The static had turned into a steady, comforting hum. As the sun began to break through the fog, casting golden ripples across the water, Hermione realized that the wheel hadn't just given them a second chance at the past. It had given them the courage to claim the present. The warmth was absolute. And as he tucked a stray, bushy lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin, she knew that the long, agonizing dance toward each other was finally reaching its crescendo. The first 4 parts of their story were about the collision. This was about the alignment. And in the soft light of the Highlands, the two most broken people in the wizarding world began to build something new, one touch at a time. She looked up into his grey eyes, no longer stormy, but clear and filled with an intensity that made her heart soar. The doubt was gone. The fear was a memory. "Draco," she breathed. He didn't answer with words. He answered with the pressure of his hand against hers, their fingers interlacing, the ultimate, permanent alignment of their broken circuits. The story wasn't ending. It was simply, finally, beginning. And this time, they were the ones holding the pen. The tension remained, but it was no longer a conflict. It was the magnetic pull of a future they were finally brave enough to face together. And as they walked back toward the castle, the silhouette of Hogwarts rising through the mist like a sentinel, Hermione knew that no matter what time they were in, they were finally home. The bit of silver on her finger caught the light, a reminder of the boy who saved a toad and the man who finally saved himself. The slow burn had become a steady, unyielding flame, and as they reached the edge of the forest, Draco stopped, turning her to face him one more time. "No more masks," he promised, his voice a low, sacred vow. "No more masks," she echoed. The approach was complete. The warmth was eternal. And in the quiet of the morning, the world finally felt right. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and for a heartbeat, time stood still. Not because of a wheel, but because of the sheer, overwhelming weight of the love that had been building for 14 years. The kiss wasn't a collision. It was an arrival. It was soft at first, a tentative exploration of a territory they had both been too afraid to claim. It tasted of rain and redemption, a slow, sensual unfolding of everything they had suppressed. Hermione's hands found the lapels of his robes, pulling him closer, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric as if to ensure he wouldn't vanish into the mist. Draco groaned low in his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the damp ground, crushing her against him. The static between them exploded into a brilliant, golden heat that seemed to radiate from their joined lips. It was a kiss that contained every argument they'd ever had, every insult flung across a classroom, every silent look exchanged in a darkened corridor. It was the resolution of a decade of tension, the final shift of the seesaw into a perfect, unwavering balance. When he finally pulled back, just enough to breathe, his eyes were wide and bright, a frantic, beautiful joy lighting up his face. "Granger," he gasped, his forehead resting against hers. "Malfoy," she whispered back, her lips swollen and tingling. He laughed then, a real, genuine sound that she hadn't heard since he was a child. He leaned in again, this time with more confidence, his mouth catching hers in a deeper, more desperate alignment. The warmth was no longer just a feeling, it was their reality. And as they stood by the Black Lake, the sun finally burning away the last of the fog, the two children who had been lost in time finally found their way to each other. The happy ending wasn't a return to a fixed past. It was the creation of a new, shared present. And as they walked hand in hand toward the gates, the silver ring on Hermione's finger shone like a star in the daylight. They were 11, they were 25, they were infinite, and they were finally, beautifully together. The transition from the mist of the Black Lake back to the structured reality of London felt less like a rupture and more like a gentle settling of dust. They did not speak as they walked back to the castle's apparition point, but the silence was no longer a void. It was a bridge. Every time their hands brushed, a jolt of tactile friction reminded Hermione that the man beside her was no longer a ghost of her memory. He was solid. He was present. And for the first time since the war ended, the atmospheric pressure of her life didn't feel like it was crushing her lungs. However, the warmth of their reconciliation was soon met with the biting cold of the world they still inhabited. By the following Monday, the Ministry of Magic felt like a labyrinth of judgment. Hermione sat in her office, the silver ring tucked safely beneath her glove, but she could feel the weight of it against her skin like a brand. The internal monologue that had once been a cacophony of doubt had narrowed into a singular, piercing fear. How long could they exist in this fragile pocket of peace before the rot in the foundation of their social standings tore them apart? The tension returned, not as a lack of trust, but as a protective, jagged edge. Draco had returned to his duties, but he had adopted a new kind of silence, a restrained, deliberate distance that made Hermione's knuckles whiten as she gripped her quills. She saw him in the atrium, surrounded by the usual flock of ministry officials. He was the picture of Malfoy composure, but she noticed the way he straightened his sleeve cuffs with a frantic, rhythmic intensity when their eyes met across the golden fountain. It was a seesaw of a different kind, the approach of their private souls against the repulsion of their public identities. "Granger," a word. She looked up. Harry stood in the doorway of her office. His expression was unreadable, his green eyes sharp behind his glasses. He closed the door behind him, and the silence in the room became heavy, thick with the scent of old parchment and the unspoken history between them. "I saw you," Harry said quietly, "at the lake on Saturday." Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. The vulnerability she usually kept hidden beneath her intellect surged to the surface. She didn't offer a dry retelling of events. She didn't have the breath for it. Instead, she watched Harry's hands, noting the way he gripped the back of the guest chair. "Harry, it isn't what you think," she began, her voice a mere tremor. "Isn't it?" Harry stepped forward. "I saw Draco Malfoy looking at you as if you were the only light left in the world, and I saw you looking back." He paused, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifting toward a crushing weight. He's a Malfoy, Hermione. The friction he brings, it's dangerous. For you, for the Ministry. He isn't his father, she snapped, the warmth of her defense rising unbidden. You didn't see what I saw, Harry. You didn't feel the wheel. The wheel? Harry's brow furrowed. The accident in the Department of Mysteries. Is that what this is? Some lingering enchantment? A magical interference? It's not an interference, she cried, standing up. The silver ring beneath her glove felt like it was glowing. It was a mirror. It showed us who we were before the world told us who to hate. It showed us that we were both just children drowning in a sea of expectations. The betrayal she felt in Harry's skepticism was a cold, sharp pain. Her best friend, her brother, was looking at her as if she had lost her mind. The conflict between her loyalty to the past and her love for the present was a visceral misalignment. I can't support this, Harry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Wizengamot is already looking for reasons to doubt your judgment. If they find out you're involved with a man who barely escaped Azkaban, they'll ruin you. Then let them, she said, her chin tilting upward in a gesture that was purely, defiantly her own. I spent my life being the brightest witch of her age for everyone else. For once, Harry, I'm being Hermione for myself. Harry looked at her for a long moment, the disappointment in his eyes a bitter, freezing draught. He turned and left without another word. The cold that followed was absolute. Hermione sank back into her chair, her heart hammering a frantic, broken rhythm. She felt the magnetic pull of Draco, the need to find him, to feel the static of his presence to counteract the isolation. But she remained at her desk, the tooth of the old parchment she was supposed to be filing, feeling like sandpaper against her fingertips. That evening, the rain returned, a torrential, cleansing downpour that turned the streets of London into a blur of grey and silver. Hermione didn't go home. She went to the Department of Mysteries. She needed to see the wheel. She needed to know that the foundation of her new world wasn't as unstable as Harry believed. The laboratory was dark, the only light coming from the flickering braziers in the corridor. The scent of ozone had vanished, but the air was charged with a different kind of energy. Draco was there. He was standing before the pedestal, his silhouette a jagged line against the shadows. He didn't turn when she entered, but she felt the atmospheric pressure in the room shift, the familiar thrum of their joined magic vibrating in her bones. "He told me," Draco said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Harry. He came to the manor, told me to stay away from you, told me that I was the rot that would ruin your career." Draco turned then, and the look in his eyes was one of such profound, soul-crushing guilt that it made Hermione's breath hitch. "And he's right, isn't he? I'm the shadow that dims your light." "Don't," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Don't you dare do this, Draco. Don't go back to being the coward who hides behind his own self-loathing." "It's not loathing, Hermione. It's the truth." He slammed his fist against the stone table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vacant corridor. "Look at us. We're hiding in the dark like criminals. Every time I touch you, I'm looking over my shoulder. Every time you smile at me, I'm waiting for the moment the world tears it away." The repulsion was radiating from him, a frantic, desperate need to protect her by pushing her away. It was the same seesaw they had ridden since they were 11. The approach followed by the inevitable, terrified retreat. "I'm not afraid of the world," she said, her voice steadying as she reached him. She took his hands, forcing his clenched fists to open. Her fingers interlaced with his, the tactile friction grounding them both. "I've fought a war, Draco. I've stood in front of the darkest wizard in history. You think a few memos from the Wizengamot frighten me?" "You shouldn't have to fight for this," he choked out, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "I'm not fighting for this," she murmured, her thumb grazing the line of his jaw. "I'm fighting for us, because the friction of being without you is worse than any battle I've ever faced." The warmth began to seep back in, a slow, sensual heat that melted the ice of his fear. Draco's breath hit her lips, warm and trembling. The magnetic pull was irresistible now, a gravity that neither of them could, or wanted to, fight. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist with a visceral, desperate alignment. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath a jagged heat against her skin. Hermione felt the tremor in his body, the sound of his heart hammering against her own, two rhythms finally finding a shared tempo. "I can't let you go," he whispered into her hair. "I tried. I sat in that manor for 3 days, trying to find a way to leave you alone, and all I could think about was the way you looked in the library when we were 11, the way you looked at the lake. I'm addicted to the friction, Hermione." "Then stay," she said, her hands finding the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the silk of his hair. "Stay in the light with me." They stood there in the silent laboratory, surrounded by the ruins of time and the echoes of their past selves. The tension between them had reached a new plateau. It was no longer a conflict of "can't stand it," but a desperate "can't help but be." The slow burn was moving into a different phase. It was no longer about the discovery of their feelings, but the preservation of them. Draco pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. The grey of his eyes was clear, the stormy clouds replaced by a fierce, protective light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was the toad. The small wooden carving Neville had given them after the train ride. A thank you for a moment of kindness that had never officially happened in this timeline. "He came to the ministry today," Draco said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "Longbottom. He said he found this in his old school trunk and felt compelled to give it to me. He said he didn't know why, but he felt like I was the person who was supposed to have it." Hermione felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. The timeline was healing. The small acts of kindness from their vision were bleeding into the reality of the present. The trust was no longer just between them. It was a ripple in the fabric of the world. "See?" she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "We're changing the ending, Draco. One person at a time." He looked at the carving, then back at her. The static in the air was humming a perfect, harmonious chord. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, tentative promise. It wasn't the desperate kiss of the lake. It was a slow, deliberate claim of a future they were finally brave enough to build. "I love you," he whispered, the words sounding like a sacred vow in the darkness of the ministry. Hermione's heart soared. The warmth was absolute, a steady flame that defied the cold of the world outside. "I love you too," she replied, her voice a soulful, unwavering alto. As the rain continued to wash the streets of London, the two most unlikely allies in the wizarding world stood together in the heart of the Department of Mysteries. They were no longer ghosts of a past that shouldn't have been. They were the architects of a present that was entirely their own. The friction remained. It always would. But it was no longer the friction of collision. It was the friction of two lives moving together, creating enough heat to keep the darkness at bay. And in the silence of the night, as they walked out of the laboratory hand in hand, Hermione knew that the foundation they were building was stronger than any ancient stone. The happy ending was no longer a goal. It was the path they were walking. And this time, they weren't letting anyone else hold the map. Part 6 was the trial of their resolve. Part 7 would be the manifestation of their courage. And as they emerged into the rain, the silver ring on Hermione's finger and the wooden toad in Draco's pocket were the only talismans they needed to face the dawn. The atmospheric pressure within the Wizengamot's central chamber was enough to make a lesser witch succumb to vertigo. It was a cavernous, circular room of dark, ancient stone, where the air tasted of old wax, cold ash, and the heavy metallic tang of centuries of judgment. High above, the enchanted ceiling was trapped in a permanent, brooding twilight. Hermione sat in the front bench of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, her spine a rigid line of defiance. Across the aisle, seated in the chair reserved for those under review, was Draco. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a king facing a coup. His silver blonde hair caught the dim light of the floating candles, and his black robes were so perfectly tailored they seemed to be part of his very skin. But Hermione saw what the others didn't. She saw the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the armrests of the chair, the same desperate grip he'd had on the luggage rack of the Hogwarts Express. The conflict today was not about crimes or dark arts. It was about the rot in the foundation of the Ministry's own prejudices. The hearing had been called to discuss the unusual proximity between a high-ranking Ministry official and a former Death Eater, a move orchestrated by those who feared the change Hermione represented. "Miss Granger," the Chief Warlock's voice boomed, echoing in the hollow space. "There are reports of personal alignment between yourself and Mr. Malfoy, an alignment that predates your professional collaboration. Reports of meetings in the Department of Mysteries, meetings at the Black Lake." Hermione felt the cold of 100 judgmental eyes. She felt the repulsion of a society that wanted to keep them in their neat, warring boxes. She looked at Harry, who was seated among the Aurors. His face was a mask of stoic duty, but his eyes were fixed on his boots. She stood up. The sound of her robes rustling against the stone bench felt like a roar in the silence. "The alignment you speak of is not a conflict of interest, Chief Warlock," she said, her voice clear, carrying the soulful resonance of a woman who had seen the end of time and back. "It is a resolution. For years, this body has spoken of unity while nursing the wounds of the past. I am simply practicing what you preach." A murmur of visceral discomfort rippled through the benches. "Mr. Malfoy is a consultant," the Warlock countered. "He is not a peer. He is a man whose family—" "My family is a collection of ghosts, my lord," Draco interrupted. His voice was like a blade drawn across silk, smooth, dangerous, and weary. He stood up, refusing to remain seated while he was being dissected. "And if you wish to judge me for the blood in my veins, you are centuries too late. I have already been judged by the only person whose opinion carries any weight in this room." He looked at Hermione. The magnetic pull between them was so strong, it felt like the air in the chamber was being sucked out. The static of their shared magic began to hum, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the floorboards. To the warlocks, it was just a draft. To Hermione and Draco, it was the sound of the Chronos wheel, reminding them that they were the masters of their own timeline. "This is not a trial of my loyalty," Hermione continued, her gaze never leaving Draco's. "This is a trial of your fear. You fear that if a Malfoy and a Granger can find common ground, the world you built on division will crumble. Well, let it. The foundation was already rotting." The betrayal of her peers was evident in their shocked gasps. She was stripping away the veneer of ministry decorum, exposing the raw, tactile friction of the truth. The chief warlock slammed his gavel. "Enough! This hearing is adjourned for deliberation. Miss Granger, Mr. Malfoy, you are dismissed. But be warned, the ministry does not look kindly on those who play with the fabric of our social order." They exited the chamber into the vacant corridor. The silence here was different. It was the hollow echo of a battlefield after the shouting has stopped. Draco stopped by a stone pillar, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He turned to face the wall, his forehead coming to rest against the cold masonry. The vulnerability he had fought so hard to hide was bleeding through. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "You just set fire to your career for a man who doesn't even have a wand that didn't belong to his mother." Hermione walked up behind him. She didn't touch him yet. She allowed the atmospheric pressure of her presence to settle over him first. "I didn't do it for your career, Draco. I did it for mine. I was tired of living in a world where I had to pretend I didn't want to touch you." He turned around, his back to the pillar. The look in his eyes was one of such profound, soul-aching intensity that it made her knees weak. The warmth was back, but it was edged with a desperate, magnetic hunger. "The friction," he rasped, reaching out to catch her hand. His fingers were cold, but his palm was burning. "It's all I feel, Hermione. When you were speaking, I felt the wheel. I felt the rain. I felt the boy I was supposed to be." "You are that boy," she murmured, stepping into his space. The scent of sandalwood and the bite of the cold stone corridor enveloped them. "And you are the man who survived." She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The trust between them was no longer a fragile thing. It was a fortress. She felt the tremor in his hands as he brought hers to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a slow, sensual reverence. "They'll try to break us," he warned, his eyes searching hers. "They'll use every law, every social taboo, every ounce of cold they can muster." "Let them try," she said, her voice a soulful alto. "We've lived through the end of the world, Draco. We've lived through 1991 twice. A few old men in purple robes are nothing compared to that." The tension in the corridor changed. It was no longer about the hearing or the ministry. It was about the visceral alignment of two souls who had finally, after a lifetime of repulsion, found their center. Draco's hand slid from her fingers to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The tactile friction of his robes against hers, the scent of his skin, the rhythmic pulse of his heart against her chest. It was a sensory explosion. "I can't help but think," he whispered, his lips grazing her ear, "that the wheel didn't just send us back to show us who we were. It sent us back to show us what we were missing." "And what were we missing?" she breathed, her hands finding the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the silk of his hair. "This," he said. He leaned down, his mouth catching hers in a kiss that was a collision of 14 years of suppressed longing. It wasn't soft. It was a desperate, magnetic claim. It tasted of rain and redemption, of old libraries and new promises. Hermione let out a small, muffled sound, a sob or a laugh, she didn't know, and pulled him closer, her body moulding to his as if they were two pieces of a broken artifact finally clicking into place. The static between them was a roar now, a golden light that seemed to fill the dark corridor. They were no longer in the ministry. They were back in the room of requirement, back in the laboratory, back in every moment they had ever shared. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes were bright with a fierce, protective joy. "No more seesaws," he promised, his voice a low thrum against her skin. "No more seesaws," she echoed. The warmth was absolute. As they walked toward the lifts, hand in hand, the silver ring on Hermione's finger caught the flickering candlelight, a brilliant, unyielding star in the darkness. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of a new world, built on the ruins of the old one. And as the lift doors opened, revealing the bustling, judgmental world of the atrium, they stepped out together, their heads held high, their fingers interlaced, a permanent, defiant alignment that no law could ever break. The final shift had occurred. The repulsion was gone. The cold had been conquered. There was only the warmth of his hand in hers and the long, beautiful, unscripted future ahead of them. The happy ending was no longer a dream. It was the ground they stood on. And as they walked out into the London rain, the sound of their footsteps was a steady, rhythmic promise of a life that was finally, beautifully their own. Part 7 was the stand. Part 8 would be the horizon. And in the soft, grey light of the city, the two most unlikely lovers in history finally stopped looking back and started walking forward. The aftermath of the hearing did not result in a sudden cinematic silence, but rather a slow, rhythmic settling of the atmospheric pressure that had governed their lives for over a decade. The ministry did not formally apologize, nor did the Wizengamot offer a gesture of peace. Instead, there was a quiet retreat, a withdrawal of the cold as the wizarding world realized that the friction between Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy was no longer a spark they could extinguish. It was a sun. A month had passed since the standing in the stone corridor. Hermione sat in her office, but the door was no longer a barrier, it was an invitation. The scent of old parchment was still there, but it was now underscored by the lingering fragrance of sandalwood. On her desk, the Chronos wheel, now a dormant, beautiful relic of glass and silver, served as a paperweight for her latest proposal. A total restructuring of the Department of Mysteries to focus on the healing of time rather than its manipulation. The internal monologue that had once been a frantic search for answers was now a calm, steady stream of plans. She no longer felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She felt the weight of her feet on the floor, the texture of the ink on her fingers, and the warmth of the silver ring that she no longer hid beneath a glove. The door opened without a knock. Draco stepped inside, and the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted instantly into a visceral alignment. He wasn't wearing his formal Wizengamot robes. He was in a simple, high-collared black coat, looking less like a senior consultant and more like the man who had stood under the weeping willow. The shadows under his eyes had finally begun to fade, replaced by a clarity that made his grey eyes look like the sky after a storm has passed. "Granger," he said, the name still a low thrum of silk and steel. "Malfoy," she replied, her voice a soulful alto that hummed with a secret joy. He walked toward her, the hollow echo of his boots on the stone floor no longer sounding like a countdown, but like a homecoming. He stopped at her desk, his gaze falling on the Chronos wheel. He reached out and traced the silver rim, his fingers lingering on the spot where their magic had first collided. "It's dead," he remarked, his voice soft. "It's resting," she corrected, standing up to meet him. "The resonance is gone, because it found what it was looking for. It didn't want to change the past, Draco. It wanted to bridge the gap." "The friction," he murmured, looking at her. "It's different now, isn't it? It's not the jar of an impact. It's static, the kind that builds before a shift in the weather." He reached across the desk, his hand catching hers. The tactile friction of his skin against hers was a grounding, beautiful reality. He didn't pull away. He squeezed her hand, his thumb grazing the silver ring. The trust between them was now the foundation of everything, a solid, unyielding stone that no longer showed any signs of rot. "I'm leaving for the manor for the weekend," he said, his eyes searching hers. "My mother wants to see. The woman who turned the Malfoy heir into a revolutionary." Hermione felt a flicker of the old doubt, a brief coldness that was immediately incinerated by the look in his eyes. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I wasn't turned," he whispered, stepping around the desk until he was within the orbit of her breath. "I told her I was finally aligned, that for the first time since I was 11, I wasn't a puppet on a string." He took her other hand, pulling her toward him. The proximity was a magnetic pull that neither of them could resist. Hermione leaned into him, her forehead coming to rest against his shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and the warmth of his body enveloped her, a sensory sanctuary that she had lived through 2 lifetimes to find. "We have time," she whispered against the fabric of his coat. "For the first time, we actually have time." "We do," he agreed, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The tension was still there, but it was the tension of a chord that had finally found its perfect pitch. The seesaw had stopped. There was no more approach and repulsion, no more warmth and cold. There was only the steady, unyielding heat of a fire that had been burning in secret for 14 years. Draco pulled back just enough to lift her chin with his finger. His expression was a map of vulnerability and strength, a mirror of the woman standing before him. "No more ghosts, Hermione," he vowed, his voice a low, sacred rasp. "No more ghosts," she echoed. He leaned down, and this time the kiss was not a collision. It was a slow, sensual unfolding of every promise they had made in the dark. It tasted of rain-washed stone and the sweetness of a future they had finally earned. Hermione's hands found his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the skin warm and real beneath her touch. It was a kiss that lasted a lifetime. or perhaps 3. It contained the silence of the library, the roar of the train, and the peace of the lake. It was the ultimate, permanent alignment of 2 souls who had been scattered across the timeline and had finally, miraculously, found their way back to the same moment. When they finally broke apart, the air in the room was charged with a golden light, a lingering static of their joined magic. Draco smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Come on," he said, interlacing his fingers with hers. "Let's go. The sun is setting, and I believe we have a life to start." They walked out of the office, hand in hand. They passed through the atrium, ignored the whispers of the clerks, and stepped into the golden, waning light of a London evening. The repulsion of the world outside was still there, but it didn't matter. They were the architects of their own reality now. As they reached the apparition point, Hermione looked back at the ministry, then at the man beside her. She didn't see the broken boy or the arrogant aristocrat. She saw the man who had looked at her in a laboratory and chosen her over his own history. The warmth was absolute. And as they vanished in a swirl of black and red silk, the only thing left behind was the faint, lingering scent of ozone and the echo of a laughter that had been 14 years in the making. The story was over. The life had begun. And in the heart of the wizarding world, the brightest witch of her age and the boy who had no choice were finally, beautifully free. The happy ending wasn't a destination. It was the friction of their hands staying joined as they walked into the dawn. Every step was a new memory, every breath a new chance. The wheel was silent, the stars were aligned, and for Draco and Hermione, the time was finally, perfectly right. They stood at the edge of the manor's gardens, the silver moonlight casting long, graceful shadows across the grass. Draco turned to her, his face a portrait of peace. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a whisper in the night. Hermione looked at the ring on her finger, then up into his grey eyes. She felt the static, the warmth, and the profound, beautiful alignment. "Finally," she said. And as he leaned in for one last kiss before they crossed the threshold, the world didn't tilt and time didn't fold. It simply stood still, allowing them to savor the one thing they had never truly had, the present.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is special to me. It is not just about magic or time travel, it is about the scars we carry. Draco and Hermione lived 2 lives. They learned a hard lesson. We cannot change the past, but we can change how we look at each other today. Sometimes the person we hate is just a person who is also afraid. I wanted to show that love is a choice. It is a choice to be kind. It is a choice to let go of all pain. I hope this story gave you a little bit of warmth. I hope it reminded you that it's never too late a second chance. Love is the strongest magic we have. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.